Welcome back, everyone. So we've done some work in planning. You just walked through the planning protocol. We did, if you'll remember, we did the Jamboard where we decided based on the performance task. We talked about what we thought was most important for teaching this unit. And when we pulled out those strategic skills, we decided based on what was on the performance task, we decided what we were going to teach first, second, third, and fourth based on what we saw for the standards and the complexity of each skill. Now we're going to look at all of these skills a little bit differently. We're going to talk about how to, before we actually do the teach, we are going to talk about, as a PLC, we're going to talk about the misconceptions that students might encounter and how we would not only identify them, but how we would overcome them on the first teach rather than identifying them after we've already delivered the lesson. So the best way that we can describe this process is a marathoner lacing up their shoes before the run. So we're going to do the lacing of the shoes. We're going to start identifying all of those, not only the success criteria based on, remember, our performance task. We're going to create a question for a formative assessment that will be a check-in. That can be our 2-week check-in, that can be our unit check-in, but for this purpose, this is going to be a check-in that we do after our first performance task. So we are, as a PLC, going to decide what that question is going to be, and then we are going to create exemplars based on what we think would be appropriate for an 8th grader, and then identify what the success criteria would look like for a student to be successful on that formative assessment. After we've identified the success criteria, we're then going to talk about the misconceptions, and then we're going to identify the scaffolds that we need to build into the lesson before we actually deliver it. Is everybody cool?
Yes.
All right. So to reorient ourselves, we like to have all of our documents with us. The documents that we use for this process are going to be our control panel, the actual performance task itself, the guidance documents, which that pull out they unpack the standards for you, and then the learning targets are also helpful sometimes to kind of reorient where we want our kids to go. The standards that we're focusing on, we have pulled out our 8C and 7B. And then from the guidance document, we've pulled out the explicit language and the discrete skills that we've unpacked for that specific standard. And we have identified that our formative assessment question will be as follows, and it's written here in green. Analyze a memoir read in class and independently respond to this question. What does the author's use of actions, thoughts, and speech suggest about the speaker's character? Use textual evidence to support your answer. Write in complete sentences. Now, it's really important for us as a PLC to have come to this conclusion before we pick the text. So we need to understand what the kids need to, what they need to do according to the standards to be successful. So here's our question, and then we choose a text. The text that we have chosen is right here on slide 4. Now, if you're watching this video, you have the slide deck in your notes. So at this point, if you would like to pause your video, you can read what we are about to use to create our exemplars. So this would be a really good point for you to pause your video, read the actual text. And this is where in PLC, we would pause as a PLC, we would do the reading that we would expect the students to do, and we would respond just like we would expect our kids to do. And we are creating exemplars based on what we think an 8th grader should be capable of. So go ahead and pause your video, read the text, and go ahead and go through each slide and read the exemplars that we have come up with. What you're going to watch after you've paused is us talking about our exemplars and the success criteria, misconceptions, and scaffolds. All right, everybody. So now that you've written your exemplars, what do you see as things or what can we identify that we see would be part of or necessary to include in a success criteria?
So in reading some of the ones that I really liked, looking at like Lucy's and Emily's, I did like that the way the pieces of textual evidence was presented. I felt that the quotes that were used were accurately used. And I also feel like I think it was in Becky's that I remember her use of paraphrasing, and I feel like it wasn't just a summarization; it was like the correct use of paraphrasing. So I think for an exemplar, that would be a really good idea to use.
Can we see what Becky did? Because I don't think I picked up on what you meant by paraphrasing.
Okay.
Let me go back to Becky's.
What slide?
I actually think it was Emily's.
Oh, was it Emily's? Okay.
Yes. And it was slide
4.
Okay.
Do you want to read it for us, Rosie?
Yes. So the speaker is self-aware of being different and can look back to why she feels that way. Even though she was wet, she, unlike the other girls, had big, thick, curly hair and was chunky. Realizing these physical differences had an impact on her the young age of 7, and the way she saw herself shifted permanently. So I like the way she was paraphrasing and also building that insight into how this was a permanent shift in how she saw herself.
Okay. Do we think that obviously the quote needs to be accurately used? Is paraphrasing something that we would do in the first 2 weeks, or is that something we might build to?
That's a good question.
I think it's something that we would build to, but we would want to highlight maybe the use, how they used it and how they used it correctly, alongside
Like
with,
celebrate not using a full sentence of text,
Yes.
but using
Yes.
the
Like
pieces.
having a summarization, because I feel like sometimes your kiddos do that.
they just pull a sentence from the
Mhm.
text and use it as their text evidence, which is still accurate. It's still answering the question and using text evidence, but this is
8th grade. So-
we want to start developing their
The additional example.
yes.
How you could do it.
If the teacher would be considering modeling, this would be a good example of one example of modeling and paraphrasing, and then another example of using textual evidence. So then the kids understand that there's different ways to answer the question using textual evidence to support their answer.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Thank you,
Okay.
Lucy.
I also noticed that identification of the author and speaker and several of the responses. So since it is a memoir, the acknowledgement that the speaker is the author.
That's a good point. And in this particular memoir, the speaker and the author are the same, but then a lot of our kids in 8th grade might think that the author and the speaker are differently, like just automatically. So having that, maybe that mini lesson or that identification, I like that a lot.
I also wanted to mention that, we teach transitions in our writing, right? But the use of transition is a form of success criteria we saw in these exemplars. So I did want to mention that.
Yeah, Lucy used transitions really well
Mm-hmm.
in her response. Like this, for instance, when it's not just such a cold shift.
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to talk about inferences. So the fact that that some of the exemplars inferences were made in their answers naturally. So I like that there was correct inferences.
Oh, it's like correct inferences.
Mhm.
Okay. All right. What else are we noticing?
I would say something about, I think, using insight when answering a question. I think that's important that the students aren't just merely restating the question
Yes.
that was asked, because then that kind of can seem like a little.
Because I don't know where kids get it, but they restate the question over and over and over again, and they get it somewhere, but we need to unteach that somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So when it just like in Emily's answer, the way she opened that up at the beginning, the speaker is self-aware of being different. So that was already kind of putting her own insight
Mm-hmm.
into that, answering that question without using the question.
Right.
such as
Right.
STEM
The
or
speaker is
something.
self-aware of
Without stating
Mhm.
what the author, how the author uses it, just the speaker.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I agree.
that's a good point.
I picked up on another thing for successful criteria was that reasoning, claims, and evidence were all present on the ones that we decided. And not in that particular order.
Right.
So there's always CER, but it still works with reasoning, claims, and evidence, or vice versa.
Yeah. That it's like obvious that there is some kind of flow, not necessarily the way the frame goes. Yeah. I like that.
For me, I also think that it's important that our kids are using that appropriate academic language for their grade level. So, for example, like I saw, there was like self-perception and criticism, self-deprecating. But I think it is important for kiddos to kind of be building those vocabulary skills that they're going to need to, especially now, like they're going to have to inject that into their writing more to help build voice. So I think that's important.
Yeah, I think so too.
And stay on grade level.
Mm-hmm.
Or that's the goal
Uh-huh.
at least.
Uh-huh. Yes. Anything else that you guys see? Okay, now that we've identified what a successful answer has or what it would take to be successful to answer this question, what do we see are potential errors, mistakes, or weaknesses?
I guess like one of the most obvious things would be if they had no textual evidence, or maybe if the textual evidence wasn't aligned to their answer, like there was no connection there. That would be a mistake or a weakness.
Yeah. We all have those
You mean like the
kids.
textual evidence doesn't support the answer?
Right.
Right.
Like we all have those kids that just take a piece of text and like throw it in there and
It
then,
doesn't connect.
yeah.
If punctuation is not used properly or just not there at all, I think it's confusing a lot of times when you're pulling a quote or just this textual evidence, it just kind of runs on.
Yeah.
Wow, especially punctuation is really gonna be a big part here if they're using quotes, direct
Mhm.
quotes.
We did
Yeah.
have
Eighth
15
grade.
sentences.
I think-
so
yeah.
By that time, they should have.
Mm-hmm. And commas, like if we're doing paraphrasing, like commas are definitely necessary.
I think
Another mistake that can happen is that, if we kind of decide to do a graphic organizer, that then it becomes fill in the blank and then everybody's kids' answers are gonna sound
Mhm.
exactly the same. So we just need to be careful.
Yeah, I agree. If it's like too formulaic, I do see that, especially like, a few years back when students were doing the short answer. I felt like all my students were just kind of doing that short answer response where it was just, answer, prove, explain, or,
Mm-hmm.
it was just very formulaic.
And
There
the
was
high
no
school
voice.
EOCs when short
Mhm.
answer was in there.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Answer the question, prove your.
Yes, and it was just, and it lacks that voice that we really need to build with our kids.
Yeah.
Which is what we want to build to for CCMR college ready
Exactly.
writing.
Yeah.
Not just being super restating the question.
Yeah.
and-
Yes.
Yeah. And even though we give them that CER frame, it's like, when do we take it away or when do we
Yeah,
challenge them to
yes.
pull it away?
Yes.
Because that's where the insight comes, I think,
Exactly.
is how you can answer that question without the frame. Okay.
I think another weakness that could be made would be an inaccurate response altogether. I know sometimes you read an answer and you read an answer that a student's written, and then you have to go back and look at the question because it's like, wait a minute, what were they supposed to be answering? You kind of get lost in it. I think it might even go back to what we talked about earlier about having no textual evidence.
Mm-hmm.
That might be a reason why it could be inaccurate as well.
Mm-hmm.
I agree.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Or another thing is just not answering the question.
Mm-hmm.
And this one's pretty straightforward, but we will have questions where they aren't answering
Yeah.
what's being
They didn't
asked.
understand the
We
question.
all
Yeah.
have those
topic.
kids that,
Mhm.
that they will write something that is really good, but it's not answering the
Right.
question. So we do need to be careful of that.
Okay. Now I'm really curious about scaffolds. Like, so we've identified what we think we're going to have issues with, or we see potential errors and mistakes. How would we build that in day one, tier one instruction so that we're not identifying these afterwards? We're trying to identify them before the lesson even happens to make sure that those barriers are knocked down for kids to be successful day one.
I have noticed, not particularly in our responses, but just with students, and multiple characters, that they'll get confused and, who's the main character as well as who's the protagonist, antagonist, or just whether it's, negative connotations. So I think something to help them out would be like a character T-chart
Yeah,
or a form of, annotating and highlighting two different characters.
I like that, especially for memoir because it's so hard. Character T-chart or highlighting.
Since we are at the beginning of the school year, second, third week, I believe we should come up with an anchor chart for appropriate punctuation.
Oh yeah.
Just to so they have that practice, the correct practice from the get-go, from the beginning, as far as where the commas go, open quotes, close quotes, where does a period or the question mark or exclamation, whatever it may be, does it go inside the quotes or or outside the quotes?
That's a good point because it's just a reference, like right in front of their eyes, so they don't have to use their working memory to think about the
so
rule.
why
They
wait
can
to
just
correct them. Let's just give them the anchor chart from the get-go and they can allude to it when they're answering them.
I like that a lot.
I also think we could provide them sentence stems. We have the CER that has sentence stems for the different genres. I think that would be helpful.
You know what would be so much fun? If we did like a challenge using no stems, right? Because some of our kiddos have been using sentence stems, for years and years, and which is awesome. Like, I think it's great. It's like we definitely need to keep using them, but also in their writing to kind of build on that. Like, we keep talking about voice, it keeps coming back in that personal narrative writing. It would be great if maybe we do some kind of like challenge, yourself to not use sentence stems, and then maybe we can have like a prize for them.
I think that's so cool because this is helping the kid who is they don't need necessarily the scaffold. We want to let them go,
Right.
and we all have those kids, and then using what they've written as an exemplar for their peers to show.
Yeah, and build more of that confidence. Like, you can do this. Like, you have the foundation already within yourself.
Yeah.
I love
For
that.
those kids that have that natural
Yes.
insight instead of funneling them into the STEM
Yes.
route.
It allows their voice to come through in their
Right.
answers.
I love that. Okay, so it looks like we've got a really good start. Now, once we kind of get through and get into our teaching, I think this is going to be a really good check-in point, and we're going to see if these potential errors, actually were errors, and if these scaffolds worked, and if they didn't, how can we do better next time?
So then is there a plan to, when we're lesson planning for the next 2 weeks, to figure out not only the daily lesson plan, but how we're going to incorporate the scaffolds we're talking about now?
Is there a plan for that?
Is that what we're going to do next?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
got it.
And we're going to go back to that Jamboard and look at where those scaffolds will fit and where, like, what day we need to have those scaffolds ready so that it makes sense for the learning and it doesn't feel like it's just cold and put in there for no reason. Yeah.
And I think it would be so cool. Okay, so we're going to implement these scaffolds. Then we're going to have student exemplars. We need to compare the student work that came in to the success criteria. And then I think we should think about, did these scaffolds work? And if they did, because I don't think we've ever talked about content-specific scaffolds to this degree. So if these worked, are we going to keep them for the rest of the year? Do we adjust them slightly? What are we going to do to keep the good first teach going?
I think what we could do is the next time we meet, we all bring like a sample of each category that we went over right now. For example, I could bring some examples of success where students met the success criteria, where I found the commonalities on the mistakes or weaknesses, and of course, where the scaffolding, the evidence or the proof is there based on the scaffolding that we
Yeah.
all do.
Yeah.
So I think we could all bring student samples.
That's a good idea, Lucy.
Thank you.